Well, hello everyone. Welcome to tonight's debate on if wars are ever justifiable. Is large-scale violence more effective than mass nonviolence mobilization? I'm your co-host for the I'm your co-host for the event and moderator, Youri Smouter. I host a current affairs program, One Plus One, which is a current affairs history program with a critical left perspective, which you can find on YouTube, and I'll make sure to post the link to that. And before we begin, I just want to say thank you to World Beyond War for this third collaboration and second time we're doing this debate. And what makes this very unique is that it's going to be between two lifelong anti-imperialist voices. And arguing that wars can never be justified is World Beyond War's executive director, David Swanson, who also hosts Talk World Radio on Pacifica Radio. And arguing that some wars can indeed be justified is Dr. Jared Ball, who is professor of communications and Africana studies at Morgan State University, and he co-hosts the Remix Morning Show, Earn Your Liberation, Saturdays with Renee, and I Mix What I Like, all of which you can find on the Black Power Media. And both of these gentlemen are coming to you from Turtle Island. And we acknowledge the systemic policies of genocide, relocation, forced assimilation, and apartheid that still impacts indigenous people. And we say in solidarity to them, Native lives matter, and we can never have justice on stolen land. Also, free Julian Assange, Momia, Leonard Peltier, World Beyond War's Yuri Shilazhenko, and Bogdan Sirotuak. And before we start the debates, there's going to be a poll which we ask you, the audience, to participate in, which is: can war be justified? Sometimes large-scale violence is a better alternative than non-violent mass action. So you can vote in that, or you can vote for the opposite, that war can never be justified. And yes, and let's do that before we get into the debates.
Youri, do you want to tell people how to do the captions?
Oh, yes. And we are going to, oh, yes. And of course, the chat is going to be open. And if you click on show, if you click on CC, you can also get, the captions, the closed captions. But bear in mind that, this is done by, robots, and it's not always going to be accurate, the translation. And then also, while we're waiting, also solidarity and to the Palestine justice movements, which like good wildfires are springing up all over Turtle Island and in Canada and in also Australia and New Zealand, and I believe in England they're also trying to get that kicking off. So that's wonderful. All right, shall we let this go on for a little bit more before closing?
Up to you.
Okay, I'll give it another. We'll give it another 3 minutes then. Oh, and if you're watching, please do share widely this. Do share widely this event, and of course, important rules during the chats. Please try to keep the. Please try to be very civil in your debates and whatnot. No name calling. Certainly no queerphobic, no racist, no xenophobic language that will not be tolerated, and of course, anyone who tries to disrupt this event will be handled. Oh, we have another person from Belgium. Awesome. Somebody from Oregon, somebody from England, Toronto, somebody coming to us from Bogota. Thank you, Maria. Yes, I got this from World Beyond War. And if you want to help World Beyond War, definitely go to their website and get some of their merch. And also go to Black Power Media's website. They also have some fantastic merch as well. Oh, nice. Somebody from Bali. Okay, I think all right. I believe we're going to end the poll now. So, yeah. Okay. I believe that's done. Alrighty. And so and we'll be returning to that poll before it ends. And all right, let's start this. All right, let's start off. Our first speaker, who's going to be presenting, Yeah. So how it's going to also run is, our first speaker is going to present his 10-minute presentation on his position. Then we're going to go to our other speaker, who's going to present his opposing proposition. After we're done with that, we will open it up to a Q&A where our guests will will answer your questions. And our first speaker tonight is World Beyond War's very own David Swanson, who again is the executive director of World Beyond War. He also hosts Talk World Radio on Pacifica, and he is going to be arguing that wars can never be justified. David, the floor is yours. 10 minutes.
Youri, before I start, that agenda you laid out is perfectly fine with me, but the original plan was 10 minutes each, 5 minutes each, 5 minutes each, and then questions. And all those 5 minutes each got left out.
My apologies for that. Okay, yeah, yes, exactly.
Okay, start your clock.
All right, 1, 2, 3. David, there you go.
Thank you to everyone who is here and hopefully planning to ask questions, and to Youri for moderating, and especially to Jared for debating. It is very difficult to find anyone willing to debate the pro-war side of a debate on war. So I am always thrilled when someone will do it. And I say that living in a nation gone absolutely mad for war, but largely through corruption of government and lies that don't hold up under scrutiny. I have done a number of these debates with imperialistic just war theorists who go to enormous lengths to avoid the topic or to name a just war, but who, when compelled to name a justifiable war, name a US or even an Israeli war. Lately, I've been debating people who oppose all US wars, but not the institution of war. It's also been hard to focus them on the topic. They've devoted most of their minutes to denouncing US wars, and I've agreed with every word. Our topic today, which I am optimistic that Jared will focus on, is, can war ever be justified? Is large-scale violence ever a better choice than non-violent action? Of course, in the corporate media, the only alternative to war for Palestinians attacked by Israel, or for Iraqis or Afghans attacked by the US, or for Ukrainians attacked by Russia, is nothing. Submission, suicide. Of course, between those two choices of war or nothing, the better choice is war. And of course, if one says that in any particular case, if one shouts, yay, fight back, resist, kill the invaders, it may please some people and offend other people. But the thought will never enter anyone's head that in so shouting, thousands of miles away from the war, you are forcing the invaded people to fight back. That would be absurd. You have no power over them. At most, you're offering your 2 cents of advice, take it or leave it. Now, the US government and NATO may be compelling Ukrainians to fight back by blocking peace agreements and supplying weapons. But when you stick your Ukrainian flag in your window, it doesn't deny Ukrainians the right to use nonviolent action. How could it? The same is true if you advise massive nonviolent resistance, if you counsel the use of unarmed civilian defense. When you offer that guidance to your brothers and sisters living under US bombs, Well, then you're accused of stripping people of their rights, as if Palestinians are as afraid of unacceptable words as a US university administrator, as if words can magically control them. If you point to the incredible success of nonviolent action in the first Intifada and the potential that should have been built on, if you quote the many Palestinians who agree with you on that point, are you suppressing Palestinian rights? If you notice the grotesque absurdity of calling the attacks of October 7th a success, as their predictable results pile up in mass graves, or note that the Russian invasion of Ukraine to stop NATO was guaranteed to be the biggest boost to NATO ever, are you being too honest? Shouldn't you rather shut up and focus on stopping the US and Israeli genocidists? Well, of course, you should focus on stopping the US and Israeli genocidists. We all should, and we all do almost all the time. But in a debate, I should also address the topic of the debate. Has violent resistance ever succeeded? Yes, of course it has, though less and less more recently. The question is what, today, in any given circumstance, has the greatest chance of succeeding, and succeeding in a way that lasts, and in a way that discourages future invasions, and in a way that doesn't risk escalation, which today risks World War III and the end of life on Earth. The research by people like Erica Chenoweth suggests that nonviolent actions, including against invasions and occupations and coups and dictatorships, have a significantly higher chance of being successful. Occupations have been ended in places like Lebanon and Germany and Estonia and Bougainville. Coups have been stopped in places like Algeria, dictators overthrown in places like El Salvador, Tunisia, Serbia, armed takeovers by corporations blocked in places like Ecuador and Canada, foreign military bases blocked or kicked out of places like Ecuador, Colombia, Montenegro. The Baltic states, NATO's darlings, actually removed Soviet occupation through nonviolent action. And Lithuania, for a time, treated unarmed civilian defense as a serious plan for the future, even though it benefited no weapons companies. Disorganized, nonviolent resistance showed great potential in Ukraine 2 years ago, before the weapons flooded in. Every day in Gaza, we are shown how the camera is more powerful than the rocket. Nonviolent action, like violent action, can be used for good, evil, or indifferent purposes. And like violent action, but less frequently, nonviolent action can fail. We should be clear, of course, that nonviolent campaigns usually involve the use of violence against them, and acknowledge that many people find it somehow more awful for people to be harmed when they are not themselves engaged in violence. The Freedom Flotilla will probably be attacked if it sails, but loading it up with weaponry would be counterproductive. The path likely to result in many fewer people harmed and a more sustainably just and peaceful outcome has to be recommended by any honest, well-meaning consideration. There is also a benefit to preparing nonviolent resistance to invasions beyond not providing excuses for invasions, namely that the same nonviolent tools can be used against unjust or apartheid states without waiting for an invasion, whereas preparing for violent struggle distracts from those efforts. Arguing in the West for the justification of war making by others is not just telling people to use weak tools unnecessarily likely to fail, but also telling the US public, the Western public, that in one way or another, the institution of war is justified. This is a global problem. When you use war, you create resentment, divisions, hatred, which create instability, which puts your gains at risk. When you use war, you sanction murder and therefore anything, lying, cheating, stealing, torture. When you use war, you teach violence, and great efforts will be needed to prevent the creation of a more violent society. When you use war, you do environmental damage, from scattering toxic weaponry in a village to heating the earth to increasing the risk of nuclear apocalypse. When you use war, you move wealth from human and environmental needs to a wealthy northern elite of weapons dealers who in turn do horrendous environmental damage, corruption of governments, militarization of police, and destruction of the rule of law. When you use war, you create support for authoritarianism, hierarchy, secrecy, and surveillance, and above all, for the institution of war, which is the top impediment to absolutely urgently needed global cooperation on climate, disease, poverty, and which is the top destroyer of wealth that could be moved to human and environmental needs, as well as being the top cause of homelessness, refugee crises, and one of the top causes of death and suffering. We need a global movement to abolish war, and it cannot be led by the leading war maker or its sidekicks. And it cannot be achieved by a balance of war powers. If Niger gets the US bases out, both Niger and the world are likely to be better places. If Niger brings Russian bases in, the opposite is true. Is it asking too much? Is it unfair to look to the global south for leadership on building global institutions for peace, when existing global institutions are twisted in favor of the wealthy and the warmongering? Yeah, of course it is. We must bring the same demands directly to the heart of the empire, but in solidarity with a global movement. That is our only chance at survival, at shifting from a war-mad world to a world focused on climate, poverty, disease, and homelessness. So is using war part of how we get there? Can war ever be justified? Is large-scale violence ever a better choice than non-violent action? Absolutely not.
Thank you, David, for your opening remarks. And now, arguing that sometimes wars can be justified is Dr. Jared Ball. And let me remind our audience, Dr. Jared Ball is a professor of communications and Africana Studies at Morgan State University. He co-hosts the Remix Morning Show, Earn Your Liberation, Saturdays with Renee's, and his own I Mix What I Like, all on Black Power Media. Brother Jared, the floor is yours, 10 minutes.
All right. Thanks, Youri. Thanks, David. Peace and greetings to everybody. And I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to have this conversation. I did struggle with the question a little in that war can be and is justified all the time by empire as the essential prerequisite monopolization of violence, which of course accompanies the psychological violence of monopolist control over dominant narratives, framing and preceding education, all to ensure claims of a just war can be made successfully. This is why George Creel can speak in terms of war when describing the process of, quote, conquering convictions of white American men, prepping them for World War I. Today, Jen Easterly, formerly of the NSA, currently of Homeland Security, talks of, quote, constructing cognitive infrastructures as militaries establish fronts, each with the same purpose. This would also be why all are awash in propaganda. We all are awash in propaganda with its parallels in news media, where, quote, message force multipliers are embedded to promote imperial violence. I see this as the symbolic equivalent of what I will forgive me for now, for now at least, as I'm terming this the Sally Hemings metaphor. That is, if one cannot say no, then even consent is not consent. If one cannot stop war, that is, even if somehow able to, despite all odds, evolve a critique of war or the claims of justification, then justifying the war is not even necessary and the victory is total. War, violence just happens. Read another way, that is the initial question of can war ever be justified? Can what are indeed morally justifiable wars against enslavement, colonization, or capital be made to be seen as just among a colonized population suffering from, among other colonial nightmares, the most organized, highly technological, and pervasive counterinsurgency, psychological warfare, and propaganda apparatus ever known? In other words, can the oppressed be convinced of the righteousness of their struggle and all required to liberate themselves and the rest of us? Ultimately, however, neither previous reading of the debate question is more interesting to me than the reading, can any war be justified? That is, if war be defined here as the conscious and politically organized use of any means necessary to prohibit permanently the violent aggression of another, then absolutely those wars can be justified. In fact, to deny both the rightfulness of those wars or to refuse support for those wars should be deemed amoral if one's claimed principles include a peace born of justice as opposed to suppressed dissent. These anti-colonial wars are justified both morally by the natural right of living beings to self-defend against the violence of enslavement, the violence of colonization, the violence of cultural appropriation, the violence of exploitation of labor, or simply put, the violence of capital. Large-scale violence is also justifiable on the objective basis of science, because, of course, as Dhoruba bin Wahad reminds us, and as the late Russell Maroon Schultz wrote, these preceding violences can only themselves be truly opposed by an equal and opposite force. Nonviolence, to which this debate subtitle refers, is not the opposite of violence. It is merely the absence of violence. And to clarify, if I may, I'll just read this short excerpt from Schultz's book, Maroon the Implacable, in which he wrote, quote, counterposing nonviolence to violence, however, totally confuses the progression of these phenomena. One cannot properly understand violence without recognizing its kinetic aspect, the motion of material bodies and the force and energy associated with that motion. This is a state that the already mentioned examples of violence exhibit. We cannot violate the laws of physics, which dictate that a body in motion cannot be checked without a body possessing an equal or greater counter motion. So we have to look elsewhere if we want to locate an opposite kinetic energy to serve that purpose, since nonviolence, by its very description, cannot be scientifically understood to contain a counter kinetic energy. In fact, the opposite of violence is counter-violence, a kinetic energy force that is capable of providing a counter motion, thereby satisfying the laws of physics, and can also serve as a check on the forward or reverse movements of violence. All things being equal, this is what can lead to a synthesis between the two, which would then be nonviolence, end quote. In an earlier TED Talk, David, I once saw give, only considers, somewhat similar to his work, Wars Are Lies, and similar to his presentation just a minute ago, only considers settler colonial wars from the perspective of the colonizer, as opposed to war supporting, that is, supporting enslavement and genocide. But he does not consider the perspective of those enslaved or colonized. From what I've seen in his book in War Lies, his focus is similarly largely on dispelling empire's myths regarding their wars. So sure, as Swanson has said, to condemn Robert E. Lee and his statue and the unnamed Confederate soldier in Charleston, South Carolina is fine. But though unconsidered there by Swanson, were he or anyone to similarly condemn the enslaved who plotted the deaths of Lee and those like him as unjust, this would only further their and our dehumanization. Finally, the role of armed political struggle seems vindicated by the historical record in its role in even just slowing the murderous genocidal wave of whiteness and capital. The absence of violence, that is, non-violence, while overemphasized in dominant historical narratives, has proven insufficient simply given the persistent violence of incredible inequality nationally and around the world. Never mind the genocide happening right now in Palestine, anti-colonial wars from the indigenous, anarchist, and Chicano resistance movements to the Black Liberation Army here in the US, to liberation struggles throughout the Americas, Caribbean, and continent of Africa, are largely responsible for whatever advances have taken place for those people. Previously, without wars against enslavement led by the enslaved, without the willingness for guerrilla war among segments of the labor movement, the pace of state violence in that capital would have only quickened. Absent those components to struggle, we see where we are headed: more exploitation, labor reversals of age, safety, or restrictions against unions, increased police violence, and a hyper-paced genocide happening in real time right now in Palestine, funded largely by a U.S. that will happily respond similarly to the little Gazas representing the potential insurgency threat here. To paraphrase Kwame Ture, the choice of violence, or in this case war, is never made by the oppressed, and therefore their engagement in such a war cannot be deemed unjust. Similarly, I agree with his assessment of the claims of Albert Camus, that ultimately power cannot condemn itself. From this and previous points of departure, I can build my defense for the right of defense. Or said differently, the refusal to accept a monopoly of violence currently held by power or the state more broadly defined. And with that, I'll yield. Thank you very much. Peace, as Fred Hampton used to say, only if you're willing to fight for it.
Okay, one moment. Okay, so both of the presentations are done. So now what we are going to do before we open it to questions is, David, you get 5 minutes to respond to anything of Jared's, and Jared, you get to respond to anything of David. You get to you can even ask a question, and yeah, and both of you get a response. But first, one moment, let me get my clock out. Okay. David, there you go. 1, 2, 3, start.
So obviously, political decisions and societal actions are not physics. The people of India or Tunisia or anywhere throw off empire using nonviolence. You see, the U.S. academics are going to look at that, and as they always do, say, "Well, works in practice, but I cannot get it to work in theory." Who cares? I mean, it's an analogy to compare it to physics. It's not a serious argument. I appreciate that Jared watched one 2-minute video and read one of my many books, but it doesn't establish that I've failed to write at enormous length on other topics. I think this habit of attaching a good cause to a bad thing like a war has been part of war propaganda for millennia, but it's not been very good argumentation. You can say, you must think the US Civil War was a smart idea or you're for slavery, even though most of the world threw off slavery or serfdom without anything remotely as bloody as the US Civil War. Even though going back in time, it would have been wiser, it would have been contrary to what happened, but it would have been wiser to end it without. You get this argument, well, they couldn't possibly have afforded to buy the people's freedom, and then in the footnote you see that it would have cost the outrageous amount of about half what they spent on the war. It's the point is going forward. The point is not who was stupid in the US Civil War and who was a genius, but going forward. If we wanted to end mass incarceration, for example, would we go pick out some fields, get young people to fight each other, kill off millions, and then draft legislation to end mass incarceration? Or would we skip that barbarity and jump straight to drafting the legislation? This is the question of what is wiser going forward. I think it's important for people to begin to understand what unarmed civilian defense is. It is much less well known than war and violence, and somewhat deservedly so, because it's growing and building and doesn't have the same massive history, but it has a history. And if you look at worldbeyondwar.org/list, you get a big list of successful, organized, nonviolent overturnings of invasions and occupations and coups and dictatorships. And it's worth recognizing that those are real, that this denial of the existence of nonviolence is no more scientific than denial of climate change. It's chosen ignorance. Unarmed civilian defense, and we're going to have an online course on this shortly at World Beyond War, is making an area ungovernable, is refusing to cooperate or tolerate an occupation. It's brilliant. It's in many ways creative and hilarious, and it's strategic and effective. And the reason it isn't done, the reason governments don't organize their people to non-violently defend their territories, is that governments fear their own people. And the same tools would be used to resist misgovernance by the domestic government. That's the reason. It's not because there isn't strong evidence that it is a very powerful and effective tool. You know, this is why Lithuania put it in place to turn back the next Russian invasion with non-violent, unarmed defense. But it's been co-opted and minimized and put under the heading of militarism because governments don't want their own people. I mean, this would require actually representative governments, actual self-governance to give people that kind of power. But it would also mean deterring, not just turning back, but deterring any invasion or occupation attempt by making clear that these people know how to refuse to be governed. That's what, you know, that's what we need to learn about, not to minimize or criticize or blame anyone who's tried anything else recently or centuries gone by for just causes or horrible causes, but to go forward in a manner that makes human survival more likely and a just and peaceful outcome in various parts of the world more attainable.
All right, Jared, you get 5 minutes. Question, response to anything that David said. The floor is yours at 5 minutes.
Sure. So I'll just work backwards. Human survival is certainly not given the current state of the world that is being largely left unfettered in quite the neoliberal fashion. So the idea that somehow armed conflict would inhibit the survival of the earth is objectively wrong. So I don't mind if people in organized struggle like myself choose to eschew armed conflict or struggle. I'm not advocating for it. I would certainly never encourage anyone publicly to engage in such kinds of efforts. I have myself never done it and will never do it. But the idea of taking it off the table as a tactic or to deny its role in political struggle and history, particularly from the perspective of the colonized, is, again, it's just anti-historical. So David can condemn and diminish with all the language he chooses, but it's simply anti-historical. And I would again argue that whether I've read everything you've written, as is evidenced in your presentation tonight and the ones I referenced earlier, you do not consider the perspective of the colonized in your argument, which is why every meaningful wing of political movements on the left throughout the so-called third world have included a condemnation of white liberals as part of their critique, because there is, as Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture argued himself, Assata Shakur similarly, from where she is freed and protected by the armed struggle and revolution of a liberated Cuba, that the liberalism of white liberalism is there specifically to work as a buttress against the colonized engaging in all forms of struggle that should be open to them. So we see that evidenced here again tonight. Let's see. The idea again that with all these references quickly in passing, almost all of which outside of the so-called third world that David has mentioned tonight, the idea that these nonviolent revolutions that you're describing have led to some kind of advanced, progressed world is again confusing to me, given the wild inequality that we see in the world. The conditions of a majority of the people throughout the African continent have not benefited from the failed liberation struggles or the incomplete liberation struggles that were violently suppressed by neo-colonial imposed leadership. So the conditions of the people in so-called Latin America and the so-called Caribbean are worsening. The Black American population has a 15 cents on the dollar income levels in 2024 compared to whites, and wealth is going to be zero in 2050. Never mind all of the other conditions of hostility and police violence and militarism in AFRICOM and the continent of Africa, et cetera, and so forth. You know, it's amazing to me that we would just give this, attempt to give some sort of undue credit to nonviolent movements for getting us here. And the idea that nonviolence is ignored and understudied is also surprising to me, given that that is outside of, I think, any objective experience, certainly here in the United States, where that is almost exclusively the promoted form of resistance, where all forms of leftward efforts, including armed struggle, have been denied in terms of their historical reference and inclusion. Armed struggle is one of the most understudied aspects, for instance, of the Black liberation struggle in this country, despite how prevalent it was and how effective it was in suppressing. For instance, Jalil Muntaqin, in his work, We Are Our Own Liberators, shows that the Black Liberation Army's willingness to engage in armed self-defense against the police led to a drop in police violence against Black people, whereas today it is at an unfettered all-time high. So again, this idea that we have advanced in some unquestioned march towards progress in some nonviolent utopian struggle is pure fantasy. The idea that preparing for violence is a distraction that you mentioned earlier doesn't make any sense to me either. I don't see why people cannot study the histories of all forms of radical struggle as they form and study all the more liberal and mainstream forms. Electronic Intifada is one outlet, would challenge your argument about the role of armed resistance happening right now in Palestine. Their reporting includes almost on a daily basis the success of the resistance movements. So I would just say that we just should include that in our study and not act like its role in world history has not been an important one.
Okay, sorry about that. And shall we do questions from the audience, or
we were to do another 5 minutes each, but
okay, then David, feel free to feel free to respond, and we'll let Jared also respond. 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Youri, and thank you, Jared. I would never suggest that human survival was guaranteed. I would never suggest most of the things I was just described as having suggested. I think that wars are very hard to control. They escalate, they grow, they risk becoming nuclear, and that, of course, eliminates human survival. I would never suggest that violence wasn't a huge, enormous factor in human history. If that were true, I would, shut up shop and go home. It's because violence has been and is so prevalent that I want to work very hard on getting rid of it. I find it remarkable. I don't know if these are prepared remarks based on that one video and book or what, but this notion that I never consider the perspective of the colonized, that the examples I used in my initial remarks left out the third world or largely left out the third world. They were almost entirely from the third world, and this is video recorded, and my remarks are sitting here on paper, and the list I've referred to at worldbeyondwar.org/list. Go and look at it and see if you can find the third world. We're learning from Gandhi up through Palestine. All of this is learned from the third world. This is not something that comes out of the first world. And this notion that because rightly, as Jared correctly indicates, because Western academia doesn't study and promote armed struggle by certain peoples, that therefore it does study and promote organized, unarmed civilian resistance is simply absurd. It doesn't follow logically, and it just isn't true. There's almost total ignorance. Almost nobody knows what unarmed civilian defense even is, which is why I started describing it earlier. People at least know what violent resistance means. They don't know that certain groups used it or that it worked in certain cases, but they have some notion at least of what it is. It's a small step up, I would suggest, in terms of public awareness. The problem with general Western society and media and academia is, as I began to remark this in this event, that you're generally told there are two choices: war or nothing. And So it's offering that alternative to war or nothing that I'm proposing, with the addition in people's thoughts of organized, massive, coordinated, strategic, nonviolent, non-cooperation, of which most people are very, very ignorant. Even most people who do it successfully. But there are parts of the world, particularly parts of the world where it's been done successfully, where it's surprisingly well known, where in fact polling in Ukraine prior to the Russian invasion had a majority favoring using it, but their government chose otherwise. So it's, you know, there are some things we have in common, Jared and I, and probably everyone on this call, including opposing U.S. imperialistic wars, and wishing more things were studied that are generally left out. But the fact that one thing is left out doesn't actually mean that something else that's supposed to it in some way isn't left out as well. So we have a lot to learn. I'll turn it over to Jared.
Jared, at 5 minutes.
Again, working backwards, there's in part because this is what I do for a living. There's no way you could look at the media targeting audiences here in the United States regarding the history of Black people and argue that the history of armed struggle has been given even mention, much less equal footing, in the promotion of nonviolent resistance as the preferred method, if not paralleled by mainstream electoral politics. So it's just there's the idea that as you said, people know what violence resistance means is patently false. I mean, having some sort of vague reference or even fantasy or something that is probably more akin to a Disney film or Star Wars or something like that is not at all what I mean by a sustained study or understanding of the role of armed struggle in resistance movements. So we would disagree on that as well. And again, it wasn't prepared so much. It was just that it was just an observation. And again, I don't pretend to have read or listened to everything you've produced. But again, listening to you tonight and reviewing what I did before today's debate, it's clear your focus is not on the perspective of the colonized. Again, mentioning listing one or two countries, perhaps in passing, is not taking the perspective of those people's struggles in producing or performing your own analysis. So that's more along the lines of what I'm talking about, and why I think it would be more easily recognized from that perspective that armed struggle is something to be more considered and appreciated. And by the way, I mean, you know, as Kwame Ture pointed out, and I think accurately, this sort of blanket reference to Gandhi as some sort of successful nonviolent leader misses so much about the context of the role that World War II, and particularly Germany's invasion of England, played on causing them to draw down their empire. So it was not as if they were backed down by a nonviolent movement in India and then borne out by the conditions of most Indians today. I think, again, we see the neo-colonial reemergence of those similar structures post that era. So again, all right. And again, I think you misheard me when I didn't say you don't consider the value of armed struggle in advancing, or as you put it, its importance to human history. I'm saying specifically armed struggle's importance in advancing the liberation movements of colonized and oppressed people. So it is not just simply a matter of violence being important in world history. Obviously, I'm talking specifically about its role in liberation movements, which is something that is not appropriately understood and is almost never referenced and certainly never studied, rarely if ever studied. And all I was saying about this point about human survival is that you part of your argument was that war of any kind is a threat to the environment. And I'm saying there is simply, I think it is, I wildly disagree with the idea that armed resistance movements would be contributing to the devolution of the planet at all in the same way as, again, unfettered, largely at least unfettered capital and all of the ravages it's continuing to impose on the planet and the rest of us. In fact, it might be, we had an interesting debate on our platform after the film How to Blow Up a Pipeline came out, whether if it wasn't itself a counterintelligence program tactic trying to entrap people. But I thought it was interesting that a film at all could be made that would even in some positive way raise the issue of revolutionary violence in inhibiting the wild extraction and abuse of the of resources from the planet and the further devolution. So again, I think it's just something that I think should be considered, and we shouldn't be afraid to move beyond the imposed and encouraged liberalism that is often the context of these kinds of discussions. Thank you.
Righty. One moment. Okay, perfect. Let's open it. I guess we can open it now up to the Q&A. So right now we are gathering as many of the questions as we can. One moment. And I hope everybody is enjoying this lively debate so far. Alrighty. Okay, here goes. The first question. So, okay. The first question is this. Do you think it would be do you think it would have been easier for the US to buy all of the slaves and set them free rather than fighting a war over slavery? But did that legislation ever have enough votes to get passed? If it was, wouldn't slaveholders fight against it? I guess that question is to you, David, and Jared, you can also answer.
Obviously, there was no legislation, and the legislation did not pass, and there was nothing remotely resembling the makeup in Congress that would have been required for such legislation to pass. And the majority of the slave holders in the South, in the United States, did not want to be compensated. They wanted to continue slavery, even at the expense of horrific war. I don't think they knew how horrific it was going to be, but they were willing to risk it. The point is that the option was on the table. People were promoting that strategy in the United States. They were holding town hall meetings around the country discussing it. The city of Washington, D.C. did it. Much of the world did it. It's absurd on its face, right? To pay money to the people who've been enslaving human beings. You should be paying money to the people who've been enslaved. But as an alternative to killing 750,000 people and burning cities to the ground and creating horrible resentments that have lasted to this day and failing in many ways to actually end slavery, which persisted and actually became worse for many people in the Deep South after the horrific war. It will be widely denounced as ahistorical for the obvious stupid reason that it didn't happen, right? But, hypotheticals in history are always, well, what if things had been dramatically different? The point is, going forward, creative, nonviolent solutions are better. They don't risk eliminating life on Earth, which is a risk as long as the institution of war persists and nuclear weapons persist with it. The one argument that you can address simply and factually is the silly argument that they couldn't have afforded to do it. It would have cost too much money. No, it would have cost less than just the money that was wasted on the war. Never mind all the horrors that grew out of the war. So it's worth thinking about. No, it didn't happen.
Jared, your response, 5 minutes.
I don't need five. Honestly, I lost track of the question, but I just continue to disagree with this point David keeps making, that somehow war is the threat to the environment, as if, again, the current state, or even during relatively peaceful times, the earth is being destroyed through the again unfettered machinations of capital and colonial exploitation. So it's the idea that that the potential for further destruction is higher should there be engaged some anti-colonial political struggle, armed struggle, is I'm not that part is not computing for me. We're already headed towards a dying and planet. If anything, perhaps arms conflict is what we need to get rid of the people pushing us in that direction. I don't know, but okay. But yeah.
Can I reply?
Go ahead.
I agree yet again that we are already heading toward environmental destruction. I agree yet again, or for the first time, if I haven't managed to convey it, that Western wealthy capitalism is dead set on destroying the planet, and is doing it very quickly, even if you exclude, as all the treaties do, the component of militarism. But it is worth knowing that militarism is a significant component in the destruction of the climate and other elements in the ecosystems that we need, and that when anti-colonial struggles prepare for violent resistance, that isn't a matter of reading books. It's a matter of sending money that's desperately needed for good things to northern, western mega corporations that make all the weapons, and getting
this is
environmentally destructive weapons.
This is my point about the fact that this issue is not being studied properly. The idea, you keep talking about it in terms of state formations feeding the military industrial complex with all these resources. I'm talking about oppressed, colonized people that don't have any money. Look at, again, the example the Electronic Intifada provides us almost on a daily basis of the resistance movement in Gaza is part of the example. My role on a 50 caliber gun mount on an aircraft carrier was specific to defend against low technological threats that the high technological computing systems couldn't deal with. So my point is, this is not about some massive state formation funding a military and loading up its otherwise deployable resources to engage in some war. This is guerrilla war. I'm talking about anti-colonial armed struggle that means to cripple the function of dominant power, that to bring them to the table, if anything, to make them realize that they have to engage in some sort of peaceful recompense if they want to survive, much less consider some victory. That's sort of that's the point I'm getting at here. I'm not yeah.
Okay, wait,
well, I mean, how is again, it worked, but again, the history is what I'm talking about that needs to be considered. History shows that those struggles played a valuable role in getting us at least to this point, in forcing. It was the role of the enslaved that brought about the so-called Civil War that forced Northern capital to try to usurp the plantocracy, to find a more peaceful means of exploiting. Look, the very field of study I come out of is replete with examples of this, as I mentioned, from George Creel to Lazarus Feld to many others who point to the role of developing mass communications in this country. Is the history of it is intimately connected to the specific purpose of suppressing even the idea of armed struggle. So my point is, those in power recognize the threat that exists from this, and have spent countless amounts of time, energy, and resources to encourage us to any other form of struggle, including nonviolent. By the yeah.
Okay,
anyway,
wait. Okay,
yeah,
new question. New question. How? Okay, yeah. New question. How do you legislate with an irrational tyrant like Putin or a warmonger like Netanyahu, or war criminal Tony Blair wants to leave his mark in history books? Legislating with power-hungry individuals? Question mark. David, your response, 5 minutes, and then Jared's response, 5 minutes.
I don't have the foggiest. I'm not proposing that anyone legislate them or legislate with them or legislate against them. I do think holding them to the rule of law, establishing institutions like the International Criminal Court that will prosecute non-Africans would be a very good idea. But resistance struggles of the non-violent sort aren't focused on legislating. When somebody's invading your town, you don't get out in the street and draft legislation. You get out in the street and block it. You get out in the street and change the street signs. You get out in the street and shut off the power. You get out in the street and flood the roads. You make the place uninvadable and ungovernable. And if somewhere down the road some legislation is helpful, or if some legislation is helpful in preparing the organization of massive unarmed nonviolent resistance, great. But you're not the evil dictator you fear that, who, by the way, isn't invading your country. People who are obeying that evil dictator and could change their behavior and cease obeying that person are invading your country. The tools, I don't know, maybe I've missed the entire question, but the tool is not, you're not gonna get out in the roads and fields and draft some bills.
Jared, your response, how do you legislate with an irrational tyrant like Putin, a warmonger like Netanyahu, or Tony Blair? I guess he's basically saying you can't really negotiate with folks like that. So what's your response?
I largely agree. I think a number of different formations and methods for addressing ourselves to legislation need to be evolved before any of that would be successful anyway. But so that's not, I'm not advocating that or focused on that. And I largely agree, if you are reading it correctly, or if I am reading it correctly, I agree with the sentiment that this is not something that can be simply legislated out of existence.
Well, if Youri, if you're going to say negotiation instead of legislation, I mean, Ukraine and
the person said legislate. The person said legislate with power, but
you can negotiate with the most evil, horrible dictators, and they did negotiate successfully with Putin, and it was Tony Blair's successors and the United States that stepped in and said, no, 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 we shall have no agreements.
Next question. Okay, let me try to understand this. I agree with this. I think war can only be ended when we first end anger, resentment, greed, etc. Is the enlightenment of humanity a prerequisite? Okay, Jared, do you want to respond to that before David does?
I'm sorry, read that again, please.
I think war can only be ended when we first end anger, resentment, greed, etc. Is the enlightenment of humanity a prerequisite?
I don't know about all that, and I refuse to I reject negative connotations being placed on anger. I am happily angry. We're not angry enough. So I'm proud to be angry, and so I wouldn't want to give that up. But no, I don't, I'm a materialist on this. So I think that the material conditions drive most everything else. So if we want people to be less angry and more hospitable and decent people, we need to change the material conditions first. And until that point, I don't want anybody to be comfortable, and I damn sure don't want anybody to be happy. Look at the world.
David,
this world requires a rejection of happiness.
Actually, David, instead of responding to that very deep philosophical one, respond to this one. And Jared, I also want your response to this. How in a real world would you expect Ukrainians resist Russia's invasion? They already lost part of their territory, Crimea, years back, and didn't fight back. What now? Expect that Russia takes over the whole country? David, your response, followed by Jared.
Well, very quickly on the previous one, most human societies have not had war, and most human nations and regions today don't have war or have anything resembling U.S. war making. And we know of there's a professor at University of North Carolina who has a collection of known, existing, and past societies, indigenous societies that have had no war, and in some cases, virtually no violence. And some of them have had no anger, no resentment, no greed, etc. I'm with Jared. I think anger is a wonderful thing, and we should not be content with injustice and so forth. But it is worth considering that there are these human societies, exact same DNA as we have, and even today, 96% of humanity lives under governments that don't do anything remotely resembling what the US government does in terms of war making. And we talk about it as this human thing. It's a US thing. But what could the Ukrainians possibly have done? Well, with no organization and no media promotion and no governmental support, hundreds of them did incredible things, talked people out of tanks, sent people home, blocked roads, turned tanks around, got towns out from under control. Even during the previous 8 years of war in eastern Ukraine that nobody's supposed to know about, both sides successfully used nonviolence to get armed forces out of their territories. Friends of ours who went over to where Russia has claimed the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, Zaporizhzhia, found that the people there non-violently prevented anyone taking over that nuclear power plant, and could have indefinitely. And the minute they turned it over to armed forces, not only was it taken over, but shots were fired at it. And Ukraine is a complex story that I can, if Youri lets me, I can go on for the next hour, but it's worth understanding that there's not an angelic side in the story, that the invasion is horrific and awful, and so were many things done by both sides leading up to it. And while you should never hold an election with armed forces on the streets, nobody disputes that in any form of that election, the people of Crimea were going to vote overwhelmingly to return to Russia. Minority groups within Crimea should be respected nonetheless. I mean, there's all kinds of complexities here, but what do you do once there's a big military invasion of your territory? You can fight it violently or you can fight it non-violently. We have many more examples of fighting it violently, but we also have the non-violent ones. And the people who turned the Soviet Union out of Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, I mean, it sounds like a hippie acid fantasy, right? But if you watch a movie called The Singing Revolution, you'll see how they did it using massive non-violent action. And now they're credited as having been saved by NATO and so forth. Absolute nonsense. So I don't know, maybe that's enough.
Jared, do you want to respond to this, or should we go to a new question?
The only thing I would want to add is that I disagree with the frame because I don't agree with the framing that Russia is involved in some imperial act of aggression here. I think they are involved in a just defense of their border and had been giving warnings for decades that the U.S. supporting Ukraine encroaching on its borders would lead to conflict, and the U.S. did it anyway to inspire to create this conflict, so it could be doing whatever it's been getting out of it and finding a new outlet for the war machine once Afghanistan was drawn down. So. But other than that, no, I'm good. We can move on.
Okay, then this question is, let's try to put it also on the micro level. Is throwing a stone by the oppressed ever justified, or a Molotov cocktail? Violence also on small scale can also lead to more violence in a reasonable way, but how can But how can you those of survival and self-defense not morally justify? Sorry to the person. I can't try to reframe that, but yeah. Any responses?
You want to go
I
first,
think,
Jared?
well, I just think my argument, if I understood the question, that's been my argument. If I understood the question,
Yeah.
yeah. So
So like small
so I'll
acts of
just,
violence, I guess, like throwing a Molotov cocktail,
yeah,
throwing stones at a
I
tank.
don't think anything should be. I'm with John Henrik Clarke. Anything that an oppressed, an enslaved community do, a colonized community do to regain its humanity is morally justified. So I'm not. I'm not. I wouldn't take anything off the table as as something to be considered, investigated, appreciated for its historical role. Again, you know, as one not engaging in any of that activity, I'm not advocating it, but I think we can't. I wouldn't want to deny it as something for people in certain conditions to consider.
The question is whether it's the most likely thing to work, to be successful. Could you say anything anybody does to throw off their oppressor? Well, does that mean anything they do that's smart, strategically aimed, and actually helps to throw off their oppressor or has a good chance of doing so? Or just anything with that motivation, no matter how misguided? There's I think, an important distinction. My interest here has been more on strategy than on morality, as some people understand it. I've debated a lot of, as I began by saying, a lot of Western, pro-Western war, just war theory professors, and almost never do they want to talk about wars. They want to talk about why I wouldn't fight for my grandmother in a dark alley. But I never said I wouldn't fight for my grandmother in a dark alley. I think it's a change of conversation that when you can apply self-defense, you can apply self-defense to what I should do in a dark alley. And the United States calls it self-defense when its troops in Syria fight against Syrians because the Syrians are aggressing against the US troops in Syria. Or Russia calls it self-defense when they launch a massive invasion of another country. You know, it isn't.
Well, actually, David, respond to this one before I get to this very interesting question.
But I'd like to respond. Hold on, but
Oh,
I'd like to respond to that. I mean, because
okay,
again,
okay.
again, but I've already said that and offered several examples and criticized your overarching example for what is more effective. Again, the world we're living in today is unacceptable. So I do not accept that the whatever non-peaceful means led us here is some sort of victory. In fact, what I'm arguing is it was the concession made to the nonviolent movement, given the willingness in some circles to engage in armed struggle, and that is ultimately what is the greatest fear and concern. So that's so I'm not denying the tactical issue here. In fact, I'm trying to get armed struggle back on the table to be considered as part of a tactic if to develop a world that is actually liberated, as opposed to one that is, as I said in my initial statement, only peaceful to the extent that there is a suppressed dissent, which is more often the case than not.
Next next question. Oh, okay. Well, David, answer this one because there are so much more interesting questions. But if a man attacks a woman and tries to rape her, does she have the right to fight back with her martial arts skills? Likewise, if someone attacks you, wouldn't you fight back?
But look, I don't mean to cut you off, but I even agree with David on this. This is not. I don't think either. This is not the question, right? Forgive me, David. I didn't mean to jump in there, but I think
agree with Jared agreeing with me.
Okay. All right. This question. How can we avoid war when the media are so biased and even subservient to the imperialist agenda? What would those creative nonviolent approaches, strategies look like? David, answer first, and then Jared.
Sorry, what would communications strategies look like? Media strategies?
Creative nonviolent approaches strategies look like? What would they look like?
Well, I mean, there's an endless variety of examples from around the world that include mass occupations, mass demonstrations, takeovers of buildings, establishments of substitute governments, refusal to obey or cooperate with occupiers, all the creative strategies that you've seen from the Prague Spring to the first Intifada in Palestine, to the Tunisians who were set off by a suicide and overthrew their government, etc. I mean, the thing is, there are endless tools of nonviolence, just as there are a variety of bombs you can drop on people. But there are, books of 1,000 nonviolent tactics that just are outlines that just scratch the surface. So there's not, there's not one answer. But the people in Gaza who shoot rockets and celebrate some sort of victory, are not doing as much toward the likely liberation of the people in Gaza as the people who are photographing and videotaping the horrors and sending messages of solidarity to the university students, and working with the people who are trying to bring in ships of aid, actual aid, not military aid. But there are endless strategies. Everything useful you can think to do other than kill somebody is a nonviolent technique.
So actually, Jared, do you want to respond to that, or can we go to the
No,
next question?
go on. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, interesting that you mentioned Palestine. So somebody typed, I understood David to say that the first Intifada was successful to some degree. Is that right? I would say that the first essentially failed. Please articulate briefly.
Well, of course it failed because it was not a complete success, because it didn't end the occupation. But it organized people. It built a grassroots movement that wasn't dominated from the top, that included leadership by women as well as men. It obtained some degree of self-governance for people, and it was undermined from the top, tragically. And then the degree to which it succeeded and the degree to which it showed that power was being built that threatened those in power, not just in Israel and the United States, but in Palestine, was buried, and it was, labeled a failure. Let's try, something else. And I can email, because my memory is not what it should be. I can email everyone who registered for this event later with some books and some movies.
That's perfect, because somebody was asking if you can give concrete examples or recommend one of your books.
I recommend all of my books and Jared's, but
exactly, me too.
But there are books like Gene Sharp's. There are books like A Force More Powerful that list some handful of these examples of the use of nonviolence, but not always against war, against other injustices. But we had a film festival just recently at World Beyond War. That if you go on our website and look at our most recent film festival, had a great film on this topic of the first Intifada.
That leads to this question, and Jared, I want your response to this. Hopefully I understood the question. Does the recognition of overshoots, overshoot by population and resource shortage being a likely fatal outcome to masses of population change, either the ethics of involvement in war or the likelihood of the occurrence of war? And is the historical event around the likes of Hitler, Pol Pot, and other genocidal leaders allow the sanity of armed resistance and outright war responses?
All right. So if I understood all of that, the first question, as I understand it, the issue with resources in the world is not that there's too much population and not enough resources, is that there's too few people with too many. We have 737 people worth $5.5 trillion. We have 4 or 5 people with more wealth and land than the rest of the people in the. I mean, that kind of wild, and that's what drives tendencies towards violence. Violence to both create that wild inequality and accumulation, and then the violence necessary at times to shake up that maldistribution. What was the second question again?
Just in the interest of time, let's go to another question.
Okay.
This is a question for both of you. So while Nicaragua has its current challenges, actually, wait, let me pause that. Yeah, so while Nicaragua has its current challenges, the material conditions for the Nicaraguan people in 2024 seem better than those in Guatemala, El Salvador. Didn't armed struggle play a part in that progress? Might the material conditions for the Nicaraguan people be worse in 2024 if not for that armed struggle? Or do you see a way where they might have thrown out Somoza and U.S. imperialism without it? Which might have wow, that's a interesting question. Jared, your response first, and then David's.
I don't want to pretend to have enough working knowledge on the specifics of that situation, other than to say, again, I think it's important to start with whatever the effectiveness of the violence in response, it's violence that brought about Somoza and the U.S. support and the backing and all of this in the first place. So, but I'll leave it there. I don't need to belabor an insufficient answer, but I appreciate the question, and I apologize to everyone for not having a better working knowledge of that situation.
Well, I would just if I could jump in, I would just say that kind of that. Well, yeah, David, your response, because it was armed struggle that finally got Somoza, the Western-backed thug, out of that country, and so what would be your response to that?
Mine? Oh, sorry, no, go ahead.
David's.
There are countries through Central America and South America that have improved their situation through armed struggles, and that have improved their situation through unarmed struggles, that have overthrown dictators without arms. Both have happened in this region of the world. The question is, going forward in a particular country, which is going to work better? And which poor country in Central America is doing the very best in terms of prosperity and civil liberties and quality of life? And of course, it's Costa Rica, where they've abolished their military, which is a very different example from the notion that you must have armed struggles. But I think on that.
Does that mean? So again, I don't know. But again, them abolishing the military, have they reached a pinnacle of leftward political arrangement, or have they just accepted a neo-colonial relationship with the United States that says, look, I don't need a military because you are our military and we're doing whatever you want anyway? And that's sort of the point I'm getting at. When I'm admitting I don't know enough about a specific situation, it's in part because I'm saying I don't have enough of an assessment of the current form of government and how revolutionary it is. And I keep going back to this point. A lot of change has occurred through nonviolent means, where we simply get a neoliberal, neo-colonial leadership put in, and where the country's privatized and run by U.S. corporations. That's not what I'm looking for.
Well, the answer, you're asking the right questions, even though you say you don't know, because the answer regarding Costa Rica is a great deal, yes, of approaching a pinnacle of progress in that region and model for
Okay,
the world,
great.
but also a good deal of subservience to the U.S. military empire. It's not as simple as you want it to be, because there's some of each
I
there.
agree. No, I agree.
I mean, this is, and the whole, like, if we categorize the nonviolent struggles and the violent struggles through history, we have to leave out a whole bunch that are some of each. It's a complicated world, right? But
Mhm.
the evidence is pretty strong that it has done Costa Rica a world of good to get rid of its military, and that the worst neoliberal rulers in that region of the world are the ones with the biggest militaries and the biggest history of violence. So, you know,
but also to answer your question, I would say it's a bit of a mixed bag, because Costa Rica is still quite subservient to the U.S. and the West. Before I get to this question, we still have some time. Let me ask. Okay, let me ask my question. My first one to you, David, which is now, obviously, we do want to see a world without war, without the use of violence, and so forth. And in that respect, I think many people would agree with you that wars are that wars are not justified. But certainly, as a guest on my program, Kalanji Chenga once said to me, self-defense is not violence. Self-defense is not it's not war. And certainly, when the U.S. and its allies invade Iraq, invade Syria, Vietnam, and whatnot, the people of those countries have every right to overthrow that imperial aggressor and that occupying force. And I would also include, we're here. You both are on a Turtle Island. Certainly, indigenous people have the right to resist settler colonialism, not violence, or even through or even the Simon Bolivar way. So, what would be your response? Yes. So what would be your response to that?
My response is what I said in my opening remarks, that I don't have the power to strip people of this Enlightenment concept of rights. People who you start out with self-defense is not violent. Well, self-defense is violent if you use violence, and self-defense is non-violent if you use non-violence. I mean, let's use words with a little bit of accuracy. But do I have a power to prevent people from using violent self-defense? How would I possibly have that power? Again, the US and British governments have the power to prevent agreements between Ukraine and Russia and fuel the war with weapons. But I don't have that kind of power. I just have the ability to offer advice when asked, and sometimes when not asked. But if I had the power attributed to me as a professional peace activist to make these students occupy these campuses, I would have made them do it several years ago. I don't have any power over them. They decided what to do, and I don't have any power over my friends in countries that are abused by Western empires to make them do this or that, only to offer them a perspective on the available facts, and to debunk nonsense like in the question that missed me a little bit back. That's a Western professorial perspective that, where there's resource scarcity and population density, that's where these backward people will fight wars. No, there's no correlation between those things. There's a correlation between the presence of oil and war. There's other correlations that are real, but not that. What makes war more likely is primarily acceptance of war.
Okay, well, Jared, I have a completely.
Well, I just want to. I just, if I can, just quickly, I think it's again, I think it's analytically and otherwise mistaken to create the false equivalence between and to refuse the distinction between even a violent self-defensive act and a violent offensive act. I think that more than the distinction my former comrade made is a devaluation of the language, of the meaning of the words. I mean, it demeans the to me the meaning of the word violence. To say again, maybe we do disagree, because if we're in if that alley situation is brought up again, and someone punches me and I punch them back, and that's equated as two violent acts, I reject that wholeheartedly. And I would even argue that were I to continue to violently self-defend beyond the one swing, I would be it would not equate tactically or morally. Okay, sorry about that. Go ahead, Youri.
Okay, then the question I had prepared for you in doing this is now, I think many of us are I think many of us are very much sympathetic to Russia's legitimate grievances when it comes to the very thorny issue of Ukraine and NATO. And I think many of us definitely feel a lot of empathy and compassion for the Palestinians in their efforts to resist violent settler colonialism and whatnot. But that being said, when the Palestinians shoot a rocket and it hits Israelis that are in a cafe or in a bus, when the IRA blew up pubs in Britain, again, I think many people understand their grievances and would like those grievances to be addressed. But when they attack, civilians, in a pub or in a cafe and so forth, oftentimes the response is more brutality on the very people they claim they want to liberate and so forth. And the very and in terms of the public at wide, they end up being much more supportive of the very oppressive state that they claim they want to overthrow.
I don't know if I catch that. I don't know if I understood or even agree with that last part of what you said.
Okay, so when the IRA, for example, blows up a pub in Britain, that makes people in Britain more supportive of the British state to be more oppressive towards the IRA. When the Palestinians commit a suicide attack, or like the October 7th attack, that usually makes the Israelis much more supportive of the oppressive state that the Palestinians claim they want to liberate. That they want to liberate their people from.
First of all,
in other words,
I don't believe that. So I don't believe that. I will admit not being up on any scientific research or data on this, but even then, I would want to look into the details of the surveys and the questions and how that was tabulated, because I don't believe that for a second. I think that's the claim that the settler makes when violent resistance is meted out on them, that, oh, this makes us hate you more. No, you hate us just as much as you did the day before. You just are now you're more angered by the fact that we responded. And I also, particularly in Israel, but I don't believe in any settler colonial situation that there is any such thing as civilians versus military, especially when everybody in the civilian community in Israel is serving in the military anyway. But even if that weren't the case, the fact of the settler colonial imposition is the policy that is driving the violence meted out on its citizens. That should be their target if they want if they want their own city. Again, Israel is the greatest threat to Israelis. Israel is the greatest. It's not Hamas. It's not Palestinians. It's Israel. So the same I would say in terms of the British, Irish, or any settler colonial situation. If you want to remove the threat of violence against your citizens, you need to remove the initial violence imposed on the colonized population.
Well, I agree in part with Jared. I agree that the big problem in Israel is created by Israel, and the most important thing to do is to end that. But I wouldn't say things that aren't true and are dangerous, like everyone in Israel is so-called serving in the military. People in Israel are going to prison for refusing to serve in that military.
Yeah,
People in Israel are taking their lives in their hands to demonstrate in the streets. against that military. I also want to reject the earlier notion that by calling all violence violence, I'm equating all uses of violence or denying distinctions between defensive violence and offensive violence and so forth. Nothing of the sort, nor am I equating Palestinian violence with Israeli violence or blaming the victims of occupation for being occupied. But there is no question that the use of violence in, for example, what was done on October 7th, notwithstanding all the lies and exaggerations and myths about what was done on October 7th, is counterproductive, not just in enraging people who see it and care about the human beings being murdered. It doesn't just increase hate, it increases killing. You've got tens of thousands of Palestinians killed with that as the excuse, not as the motivation. It's not revenge. It was long-standing genocidal desire, but as the excuse. It is just patently counterproductive.
Actually, Jared, a very quick follow-up. But okay, now a lot of us understand Russia's grievances when it comes to the West, NATO expansion, and so forth, and their sovereignty constantly being violated. But when Russia invaded Ukraine, that only made Ukrainians more supportive of the anti-Russia derangement syndrome, only made NATO more popular amongst the West, and had new members of NATO joining. So while a lot of us do understand Russia's grievances with the West, hasn't their invasion of Ukraine only made Ukrainians now be more supportive of the ultra nationalism that is in the country, as long as making the collective West much more supportive of NATO.
Again, I don't have enough immediate information to track the change over time, but the white supremacist reactionary nationalism in Ukraine existed before the Russian invasion. The hostilities, again, I don't believe, and it's similar to my last answer, I don't believe that the Russian invasion, and I wonder if I'm even using that. I'm not even sure whatever, but I don't believe that the Russian invasion, whatever. I don't believe that. I just don't believe that increased anti-Russian sentiment among NATO or anything. Again, the pre-existing sentiment is what drove the hostilities that led Russia to take this action, giving decades of warning.
So all the polling. I mean, the majority of people in Finland and Sweden opposed their countries joining NATO for years and years, up until the moment of the Russian invasion, the special cute military operation. And then a majority supported joining NATO. Their governments always wanted to join NATO, but the people didn't. Not until Putin did what everybody ought to have known, including him. I'm sure he did.
I can vouch. I live in Belgium, which is the belly of the beast when it comes to NATO and the EU. I'm in Berlin right now, and I can tell you it's very hard to make the anti-war case.
But again, it doesn't.
Russia's grievances because of Russia's.
But the polling is irrelevant. And you again speak to the point I'm making. The governments wanted to do it. NATO and the U.S. wanted them to join NATO. And the hostilities against Russia were continuing. So to blame Russia's choice of a defensive action for the reason that these countries the governments are able to move their populations to what they want is, again, even if you wanted to say Putin fell into a trap, the point is it was a trap set by people intending for this to happen. And that's the initial aggression that should be the focus, not his response.
There's a Rand Corporation report spelling out exactly that trap, advocating creating that trap just as they created it and just as Russia fell into it. Doesn't exonerate Russia for all the mass murder it's engaged in.
Mass murder. Again, this is all right. Whatever. I just.
Let's not get too hung up on the words.
Yeah, that's fine. All right, that's fine. That's fine.
Killing lots of men, women, and children violently.
No,
which was what was happening, which is what was threatened against them, which was what was all being geared up against them
Jared,
in advance.
but
So again, I don't.
but Jared, I don't deny that, and I agree with you on that. I but again, it's about what's more effective, because remember when
And we'll see what's more effective.
because
We'll see.
because remember when all of us, when we were laughing at the idea that Russia would invade Ukraine for obvious reasons, and we were making fun of Joe Biden when he said that an invasion is imminent. We were all laughing at that, and then when Russia did invade, it was like, uh-oh. And it has made making the anti-war case far more difficult, especially in Europe, where I'm based in, because of Russia's invasion of
Here too.
anywhere. It's very hard. It's very hard to be anti-NATO. so yeah,
why is it hard to be anti-NATO? I don't find it difficult to be anti-NATO at all.
Well, I'll tell you, and I note that we are over time. I don't know if that matters to anybody or not, but we're planning events in Washington, D.C. when NATO celebrates 75 years of NATO in July, and we've been turned down by the peace churches. We've been turned down by the universities. We've been told, I love peace, but I love NATO more. I mean, we couldn't get a venue. It's far, far harder to oppose NATO in the United States or Europe right now than to oppose war in general, or a particular war, or a particular weapon. I mean, it is the hardest thing in the anti-war world, is to oppose NATO, because NATO is the salvation from the Russian threat that invaded Ukraine.
No, because
I'm not telling you what I think. I'm telling you what I'm up against.
No, I'm saying that may be the language used, but I think the reality is that NATO is defended, particularly in the West, because it's Western empire.
Of course.
Okay, so okay, all right, okay, my bad. Okay, all right. I just want to make sure we.
Okay, look, okay. Final one before we go to the before we go to the poll. Final question to David. David, what would you say to people? Again, this is like this would be the Palestinians. This would be anyone who's under brutal colonialism and whatnot, when they say that we need to fight fire with fire. We need to. The late Khalid Mohammed, very controversial to some people, he once said that we've tried nonviolence. We've done every single peaceful thing, and now we need to speak the language of the white man. The white man only understands violence, and we need to speak in a language that he understands. So what would be your so what would be your response to that, and other for lack of a better word, Iraq, Vietnam, Syria, whatnot, all those people resisting Western imperialism, that they have to use violence against.
I don't want to say I haven't learned anything through the course of this debate, because I have, and I've appreciated many things that Jared has said, and many of the questions that have been asked, and things that you've said, Youri. But my answer, of course, is to basically reiterate everything I've said through the course of this debate, and to point out the irony that same excuse, that same logical justification, is used by the Pentagon, right? I mean, why do they have to use violence? Why are some of these questions asking, how do you possibly deal with monsters like Putin? We must use violence because Putin only understands violence. While in the back rooms, they're, shutting down the negotiations in Turkey, where Putin has agreed to a peaceful compromise resolution. I mean, this is what is always claimed, honestly or not, by advocates for violence, is that the other side doesn't understand anything else, whereas the other side always does. You can't have a government run by a lunatic. It doesn't exist. You have governments run by some horrible people, but it takes a group of them, and they can't all be literally insane. And they were negotiating all kinds of things with Adolf Hitler, prisoner exchanges and so forth, while saying that they couldn't negotiate. The Ukraine has been negotiating on on prisoners and on safe passage routes and on trade and on coastal agreements, while claiming that you can't negotiate peace with the monster on the other side, and the other side claiming the same thing in reverse. It's because they don't want to negotiate peace. They don't want you to pay too much attention to all the other things they are negotiating. The notion that the other side is inhuman monsters you can't talk to is at the root of war propaganda, and it's bullshit.
First of all, Youri, wait, please let me say this. Please let me say, I got to have the clip of you asking David a question asking David to respond to Khalid Muhammad. I think that's the funniest thing I've seen in these internet streets in years. That is hilarious.
I'll have
but just quickly, all I want to say in response to what David you just said there is that this is sort of a problem I've been having with your argument all night. To equate the United States with a Khalid Muhammad or a Black liberation struggle as both sides making the same argument. He's making the same argument as the Pentagon is exactly the point. The anti-colonial violence is to try to disrupt the monopoly of violence that the state has. The U.S. has all the resources. They have all the military. They have all the capability to engage peacefully, to do all to rearrange its relationship to the people, to the communities it oppresses all around the world and in this country. So to simply say that both sides say the same thing and use the same language and engage in the same is, I think, to miss the entire point about, again, the role armed struggle plays, particularly in the struggle of oppressed, colonized, and liberation movements of those communities. It's a false equivalence that you're creating there.
Somebody had a very good thing to say about violence, but I can't find it now, and we're running out of time. So before we end, let's look at Guy, if you can. Let's see the poll of so let's see the poll on, and let's see how many people chose if war can be justified versus war can never be justified. So the first poll was David, can you read it out by any chance?
Well, just to be clear, there we did a before poll and we're doing an after poll.
Yes.
Now.
So right now, folks. Folks, audience, please vote on if you on if war can be justified or if war can never be justified. And then we're going to read out the previous poll before we read out the final results. And I hope, and while we're waiting for that, I hope everybody has been enjoying this. It certainly has been a very lively discussion.
Well, let me just say, since we have a moment, let me just say now, because I actually have to be somewhere in 15 minutes anyway. But I appreciate this. This has been great. And thanks to Youri, David, and everybody for participating. And yeah, that's it. I just wanted to say that this has been fun.
Oh, where's the I just lost the I lost our poll.
I see it in front of me.
Okay, that's good.
It's tabulating still.
Right in front of me. If the hosts or co-hosts do anything,
Guy, can you try to pull up the poll?
It's doing just fine. Do you want me to end it?
It's still ongoing. Then we can allow a few more.
We only have 69% have participated. Where is everybody else? What are you all doing?
The two polls won't be exact equivalents.
Okay, well,
different number of people will have voted.
Okay, well, listen, whoever has the poll in front of them, please read out what was the previous one, and then we'll read out the final results of the second poll. For some reason, I've lost that and can't find it.
Well, the before poll had a remarkable, outstanding 73% starting out agreeing with the proposition that I argued, and 27% not. The after poll, currently, I am horrified to say, having never had this happen in any debate ever in the history of me doing debates, is currently at 63 to 37, not 73 to 27.
So the winner of our debate is Dr. Jared Ball. Is that what you're saying?
No. All I've won is to lose apparently less than any other of David's opponents. I lost by a less smaller margin. I thought that's what I thought you were saying.
No, Youri's right, and you're wrong, Jared. You've moved people to your point of view.
I see.
In all my previous debates, I've moved people to my point of view. Now, people have come and gone during the course of the event, and more people voted in the beginning, and fewer people voted.
I get what you're saying. Okay,
but
all right, well,
the percent that agrees with me shrank from 73 to 63 in the course of the debate. That's bad. That's
Well, one of our attendees, Wilbert, says that winners are all, and Laura Horani says you are both winners. And I think in closing, before I close, first of all, thank you to the audience and thank you to people who participated in that poll. And I want to thank David Swanson, Dr. Jared Ball for agreeing to come on, because it was actually very difficult to even get anti-imperialist voices to come on. So we really appreciate it. Yes, I'll tell you about it off the air. And we have to thank Guy, who's been helping us coordinate all of this. And I'll just say that in order to get to a world beyond war, we do have to strike at the core of it, which is Western imperialism, and for that, I think we all can, and that we all definitely can agree on.
Right,
absolutely.
Thanks again, everybody.
Until then, everybody, have a good night, and Jared, you sign us off with how you normally say peace to people. I think that's a great way.
Just always peace, only if you're willing to fight for it, like Fred Hampton used to say. Thanks, everybody.
Power to the people.